That's up your life right now, so.
Oh.
Yeah,
Not going to start talking about academics.
Is it actually already streaming, or it's just like?
yeah, just so we can get the two.
Oh gosh.
Yeah.
Well, here we are.
Sorry to be a damper on the conversation.
Oh no, I appreciate the warning. Watch that if I caught up. On the record.
Okay, so I'm gonna check downstairs.
Okie dokie. Do you want me to like say something in like 30 seconds if you can hear me or something?
Great idea. Why don't you do
Okay. Today's gonna be the day. I actually don't know Rainbow Connection from.
I've never heard it. You should sing it so I can get to know the song.
Well, so you should listen to Kermit sing it, but then you really should go and listen to the Paramore Weezer duo cover. And I'm financing that on the live stream. I will happily go on the record and say that it's a very, very good cover.
I'm not sure. Well,
and suddenly it becomes like, what is going on? Cancel. Explodes.
Yeah,
Expose. PhD scholar has music taste of someone stuck in 2003.
It would be very funny if this was something that would be canceled.
I was like, was the last time anyone recommended that someone listen to Paramore while I was still in high school?
Literally, I recommend it.
I was sitting in high school, and then you were already.
That's true.
I unironically recommended a Paramore album to a friend of mine less than a month ago.
Yes, we know you.
It's about me.
The other day I saw this like comment on Twitter where like I sent the thing that I sent you.
Yes.
Where the guy was like trying to draw like someone's.
Oh, I'm saying stuff to see if Daniel can hear me.
The poster just said like sad boy music, some obscure shit. And I sent it to like, how do I
People can sit on the floor. If anyone wants to sit on the floor, we're not starting yet, don't worry. But if anyone wants to sit up here, there's a little bit more space.
Yeah, peer pressure.
Yangang, these are my dear peanut gallery friends. Yes.
So this is a safe zone, but it's one in which you must participate. Not vocally, just have something to throw at you. Oh, I do have other things to say.
I have
Safe for everyone except. Yeah.
But did you actually say that?
Yeah.
How are you?
I got legs like this.
Me too. I do after this. Oh wait, that looks like work.
This is work. Okay.
You might follow him on Twitter as Lady Gaga.
I use exclusively. You have no other. That's pretty cool. Yeah. I don't know if it looks like work, but I do it anyways. Big work. So, yeah.
Good.
She came back home.
Taking risks for other people.
Yes. And now I know.
This might actually be a safe way for you.
She's gonna do it.
Usually.
Smuggling.
Yeah, you also
So, like, I pushed her to apply.
Yeah, I was gonna say, no, it wouldn't.
You know, it's
Did you guys hear about the
2 hours.
the
You know, like, it's like,
Wait, is it really?
Like, because when I was at Stanford, when police batons struck down.
Yeah.
This one.
Wow.
Yeah.
See, that's the review you should write to Apple. Be like, can withstand police. Very sturdy. Yeah.
Uh-oh. Oh no.
Ryan. Oh, William.
No. Okay, I'm gonna like.
Someone want to go?
Wait, do you know who set that up?
I assume so. Yeah. Yes. Oh, it's just tape. They just never tape.
You wanna try to see if we're gonna get someone?
We should go get some. Yeah, they need more tape. Yeah, there's more tape. More tape. So, yeah.
Daniel's already here.
So, it is also
See, this is why I was in favor of no power.
because it's so you think of that.
This is something the discussion about the disagreement.
Oh, no. Just like, like, that mic. And I was like, yeah. And like afterwards, it was like, yeah. I was like, I don't necessarily want that to be the first thing that everyone that I want.
What?
And now it will.
Because it's like you only hear
Right, yeah. Well, yeah, it's. I ran. Yeah, except I didn't expect
Share. Would that be better? Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. You want to share yours?
Actually, I was a very nice young man who studied life insurance in Japanese during the Japanese colonization, and I initially was like, okay, and then he explained it to me, and I was like,
Hey everybody. Hey, we have packed house today. So thanks for coming, everybody. And so just to introduce a bit about ourselves, we're New Bloom Magazine. We were an organization founded after the Sunflower Movement. We write on Taiwanese politics and social issues daily. We have a publication. We run the space, and so one of the things we do here is that we hold events such as these, public fora, discussion, reading groups, screenings, etc. We also do some other things. For example, we have a podcast. We have plans to do other things, such as launch a arts publication soon. So if you're interested in that, there's a lot of room to kind of plug into. And so what we're here today to discuss is the 7-year anniversary of the Sunflower Movement. And today we have Lev Nachman and I discussing this. So just a bit about ourselves. I guess I'll start with myself. So I'm Brian Hu. I'm one of the founding editors of New Bloom Magazine, and I was a participant in the movement. And so I'll be discussing the movement, what happened then, my experiences, but also just the kind of how we can understand the movement and its relevance today, or irrelevance to Taiwanese politics today. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lev. I'm a PhD candidate at UC Irvine in political science, and my dissertation is about post-Sunflower Movement political parties, which I'm going to talk a lot about later. And thanks, New Bloom, for having this event and for inviting me to speak here today.
All right. So yeah, I guess I'll just jump into it. And so I think we can just go over what we'll discuss today, and then later on we have a Q&A. So to start off, what was the Sunflower Movement? Sunflower Movement comes in the legacy of a history of protests in Taiwan. There has been a history of student movements, for example, in The most famous example is probably the 1990 Wild Lily movement, which was an instrumental moment in the transition to democracy in Taiwan. That involved students occupying the Chiang Kai-shek Memorial, now known today as Liberty Plaza, that's right, Liberty Square, because of the fact that this happened there. And so there are many ways in which I think this is a pivotal movement that sets the kind of the prototype for other movements that follow. There's only so much public space in Taipei, so there's only so much places you can occupy. Oftentimes you do have the same set of buildings around government buildings, same set of areas around government buildings or around public areas such as the Chiang Kai-shek Memorial that are being occupied. And this is where also you have the pattern, for example, of social movements being named after flowers or plants. So in later years, we'll have the sunflower movement, of course, but also the wild strawberry movement and so forth. Here are more photos. So one of the pivotal movements that kind of led up to the sunflower movement was the 2008 wild strawberry movement. This was also a student occupation of the Chiang Kai-shek Memorial. It was much smaller and it was in protest of Chen Ruining, the Chinese official coming to Taiwan. What caused a lot of blowback to Okay.
So you mean goes messing with her.
Oh,
Both sides are
Okay.
Yeah, well,
Whatever.
we'll talk about it.
I feel like it will happen again. So. You take bets on whose presentation. Okay, so the wild strawberry movement, one of the reasons why this caused so much backlash was because this was right after, for example, the KMT had returned to power. This was when Ma Ying-jeou was coming to power. So Taiwan is a formerly authoritarian country. The KMT was the single party that ruled over the authoritarian period. There's democratization, but the KMT eventually, despite being a party that opposed democratizing, it ran in electoral politics and was successful in winning back the presidency from 2008 to 2016. And so there's concern that as soon as the KMT returned to power, it took steps to try to push Taiwan towards unification with China, allowing Chinese officials to come to Taiwan to discuss trade deals and so forth. That when Chen Ruining came to Taiwan, there was already so much police presence surrounding him. People viewed this almost like as a return to authoritarianism. If you're displaying the ROC flag, for example, around the parade route where he was kind of traveling around, like the police would come and make you take it down. There was a record shop, for example, that had its door broken down because it was playing Taiwanese Hokkien songs during this time. And so this led to concerns, and that's regarding the relation of Taiwan and China, and this comes to play a major role in the sunflower movement, as we'll turn to next. And what's interesting too is that, nope, that's not gonna work. Maybe I should have figured it out a bit earlier. Shit. Okay, whatever. Maybe I should have thought of that earlier. So the thing is that there were a number of movements that popped up in the years between 2008 and 2014. So just see a few of them. They're all about different causes. You can point to some similarities. The anti-media monopoly movement was, for example, it was in opposition to the purchase of Taiwanese media companies by pro-China business groups. These are Taiwanese business groups, but they're very open about their interest in advancing positive views of China in Taiwan to push Taiwan towards closer political relations with China. And so the Wantwant Group is the main target of that movement because of their purchase of the China Times, CTI TV, etc. And so they're, because of the fact that it's still an issue today, even just they came up in the last set of elections that they were using their hold on such a large chunk of media to really disseminate pro-KMT views. And the CEO of the Wantwant Group was also using that, for example, to push his own political candidate, the one that he favored among the KMT, that being Han Kuo-yu. And so, for example, in May 2020, in May 2019, there was 70% of airtime was devoted to Han Kuo-yu, just 70% of airtime devoted to one candidate. And so these are problems that still exist today. The Hong Chong-Xiu incident was another major incident. That was regarding the death of the military candidate, the military draftee under mysterious circumstances. And it was thought there was foul play and a cover-up in the military. And this was another movement that kind of brought people. I know, see? It happened again. Yeah.
Should I just stand and hold on?
I don't think that's...
If you want to.
Yeah, Yeah.
Okay, you keep talking and I'll.
Okay, cool. Yeah, this happens. Well, you know, improvising, things happen.
China.
Yes, that's right. The invisible hand of China. Yeah, and so another one of the kind of very salient issues are, for example, to do with the environment or the land. And for example, because of one of the issues at stake at the Sun Farm being just the Taiwanese identity and the relation to China, you can see how these are salient issues. For example, just in Miaoli, there was issues regarding land evictions of residents in Miaoli, the demolition of a pharmacy owned by an elderly couple. And then, for example, in other places, you'll have demolitions of, for example, Huakong community, which is a military settlement village populated by the descendants of troops that came with the KMT to Taiwan. The Lesheng Sanatorium struggle, which is it's a kind of a leper colony during the Japanese colonial period, and the elderly residents there were being driven off for development. The Wong Pavilion struggle, which is about a former brothel, and so regarding sex workers and so forth. And then another key movement is the anti-nuclear movement, which is also still a salient issue today. Because of the fact that there's concern that Taiwan's frequent seismic activity could lead to a disaster similar to the Fukushima disaster. And so in these cases, the Biden administration was in power was accused of being very developmentalist, trying to push for development of Taiwan economically without actually really caring about the people here. And that tied into identity concerns, for example, regarding historical preservation, regarding just land itself, which I think often arouses strong national sentiment. And so that is in itself quite interesting. And how do I get back to the
PowerPoint.
Yes, PowerPoint. Okay, so next slide, which is actually also another thing from the website, except I just don't remember which part. So then it's interesting then, because then when we talk about the Sunflower movement, we can actually see that there are many layers to the movement. So to kind of explain about the movement and what it was, it broke out on the anniversary of today, March 18th, 2014, 7 years ago to this day. And what it was directly concerned with was a trade deal that was to be signed with China. This was the Cross-Strait Services Trade Agreement, and it would have allowed for Chinese investment in Taiwanese companies. And it was thought that because of this would have large influence on Taiwan's political freedoms, because the service sector industry is such a large portion of Taiwan's economy. But then in that sense, there were actually more than one demand movement. I mean, the movement is often remembered now, retrospectively, 7 years later, as a quote unquote, let's say, anti-China movement, a movement that was opposed to closer economic relations with China that would have allowed for China to influence Taiwan politically. However, there are many people that, for example, during the movement were only opposed to quote unquote the black box that was used to describe the way the agreement was passed. The agreement was passed in under 30 seconds without a legislative review by the speaker just having the megaphone standing in the bathroom. That's a story and how it goes anyway. So that raises procedural questions that the due process was not followed for this agreement, and so that's why we're opposing it. For other people, they're opposed to this agreement because it was an agreement to be signed with China. And so there's the political implications regarding identity and sovereignty issues that comes up there. And a third layer, which was kind of more left-wing, but least seen argument, was opposition to the CSSTA as a trade agreement that was a free trade agreement, just opposition to the notion of free trade in general, and also just because of the fact that the way it would influence, for example, Taiwan's working class. And so that came up the least, but that was also kind of a segment of it. And so these kind of three different layers all intersect in the movement, because there are many different groups in a movement, at any given time. And so, for example, there were people that were more pro-Taiwan independence, for example, people that were trying to push for a referendum on Taiwanese independence, the Gongchongmeng, the Alliance of Referendum for Taiwan. There was, for example, the Untouchables Liberation Area, which is a more left-wing spin-off of the movement that was more critical on these kind of free trade issues. And there was also, interesting enough, just kind of division within the movement between the people that were in the legislature and outside of it. The movement is usually thought of in terms of being the 23-day occupation of the Taiwanese legislature. That also happened on the first day. There was a kind of charge into the movement, into the legislature. This was an action to protest the fact that the CSSTA was planning on pushing for this agreement. But then it turned into an occupation, and there were people that were in the legislature and outside of it. Oftentimes there were kind of NGO groups outside of it, while there's a group of students inside. Supplies were kind of diverted inside. Let me just go back to the site. I'm gonna pull up my fancy map of what was going on there. So for example, this is the occupation space as a whole, just the map of the area. And there are different markers for different features of the occupation encampment.
And update the live stream.
Okay.
Is it still stuck
Cool.
on the?
Is it stuck?
But keep going.
Okay. So yeah, there were, for example, there were different supply centers around it. People built libraries. There's places you could study, just hang out. There are a lot of public discussions, for example, just place around the legislature. And in the meantime, in the legislature itself, there's kind of this interesting dimension where just there were students there, and they were kind of in the center in the legislative council where legislature normally meets. So this is kind of a very powerful symbol, also occupying forcibly where the electoral process of the government take place. This is the top view. You know, there's a bathroom here, legislative chamber here. You also have this cutaway view, which I designed. So this is the. This does not actually make any sense in terms of like 3D. It's been out because it's like flat, but also like I don't know. So you have the legislative chamber here. There's a second floor entrance here. This is outside where supplies are being passed in to that. It was kind of dangerous actually sometimes. There's a restroom here and meeting room, and you have a kind of photosphere here. Somebody made this during the movement itself. You kind of turn around and see just this. And so there's a kind of an interesting space within the legislature too. It's kind of like some people described it almost as a panopticon. The people inside are being viewed constantly. They're constantly being under public scrutiny. PowerPoint, okay.
Daniel, is the color supposed to be like that?
Oh.
Our projector doesn't really work very well. I think it's fine. Anyway, so continuing. Okay.
Oh.
Okay. Cool. I guess it's just a computer.
Don't touch anything.
Yeah. Well, hopefully the screen doesn't fall again either. So then you have this kind of movement then that lasts for 23 days. And there are different phases to the movement, and there are different major actions. The first phase can be said to be the initial occupation with the kind of legislative branch being occupied. That lasted for about 5 days, and there was kind of no response from the government. And so there's an escalation action that happened later, which was attempting to invade the executive branch of government, the executive branch. And that was it was a controversial event because of the police violence that happened, because of just the police came in and were brutal and attacked students, whereas this did not really occur with the legislature. But also some people viewed that action as unjustified, that the students had maybe crossed the line in trying to occupy another branch of government when there's the view that this would actually disrupt the operation of the government. For example, the legislature is not normally in use except as a kind of meeting chamber, but the executive branch of government is actually in operation. There's also a belief that the students were they crossed the line or just disrupted too many things or broke too many things and so forth. So there's actually a lot of backlash in the beginning during those kind of first few days after the action, after it took place on March 23rd, the night of March 23rd into the early morning hours of March 24th. But later on is remembered as this action that kind of brought more attention to the movement. There's a belief that there was not a lot of coverage of the movement in the first week that it happened, but after all this police violence, there was kind of more focus on it. And so actually, I was a participant in that action as well, in addition to the initial charge to the legislature. So here's some pictures of people live streaming within the legislature, just like we're doing here today. So what's interesting too is that the students were very self-conscious about having to correct misperceptions about the movement, trying to get images of the movement out to the outside world, because they knew that the media would just automatically label them as troublemakers. That these kind of pan-blue media outlets that had been monopolizing the media would actually just use this as an opportunity just to try to discredit them, saying that they're troublemakers, that they're doing drugs and having wild sex in the legislature and that sort of thing. It just happens. I think that happens. I think that the US have this kind of accusation against social movements in Taiwan that young people are just really wanting to have the public attention on them as young attractive people that want the spotlight, or that they're just wanting to be influencers or things like that. It's interesting actually because during this period of time, this is after, for example, Occupy Wall Street in 2011. There's a wave of occupation-style movements around the world during this time, including in Taiwan. There's briefly in Occupy 101, which is Taipei 101, which is a one-day event. You see some of the protests in Japan, for example, during the anti-Fukushima, anti-nuclear movement after Fukushima. Just similar, there was a tent set up in the center of Tokyo, which was like another occupation. And so the Sun movement kind of occurred in the context of this. And it's also during this time, you'd have this popular narrative around like the Arab Spring or Occupy Wall Street as being very savvy with social media. It's actually not the same as it is today, though. For example, live streaming was fairly new at that point in time. And so I remember I did interviews for that website I showed you earlier, which is an oral history archive of the Sunflower Movement. And just a lot of people were like, oh, well, it's the first time we're ever live streaming. We're downloading the app in the legislature now to get these images out there, and so forth. And then with the media coverage of the movement, you had the kind of heroization of these leader figures within the public eye. And so people like Ning Feifan or Chen Weiting and people like that. And so, a lot of these people that came out of the movement, which are still around today, and Lev will talk a bit more about that later, because some did enter politics or are still present in public life in some form. And there were questions regarding, for example, state violence, the relation with the police raised during that. Similar to a lot of the other movements during that point in time in Asia, there was this kind of discourse of being very polite to the police, trying to be friendly to them, backing them for their activity and that sort of thing. You saw that in Hong Kong actually later on during that point in time in the umbrella movement. And during the umbrella movement, it's still possible to back the police for helping and whatever. But then, as we see with the past 2 years events in Hong Kong, things have kind of deteriorated in terms of the relation with the police. This dynamic is present, for a lot of people, they were saying, this was the first time that experienced state violence. A lot of the participants in the social movements that appeared in the years before the Sunflower Movement, such as the struggles regarding Dafu Miaoli, or just different eviction struggles, that say they all kind of often had this subjective experience of like, well, now I know what's it like to experience state violence. And Taiwan being a former authoritarian country, this raises specters of that past. And so it's interesting too, because then regarding one of the outcomes of the movement is that a lot of people did actually enter government. So people went from receiving state violence to entering the state, from occupying the legislature forcibly to being elected to the legislature. And so I think what's also interesting is to look at the kind of the occupation space itself as a sort of oddly utopic space. This is often used to describe kind of legislative, occupation style movements in legislatures or around legislatures or wherever in just public places. There's a sense of just kind of all this free stuff being available that's normally not there. There's all this food and water, blankets, tents, people providing like free transportation to different places, and so forth. And that's something that's I think a lot of people were also feeling that this is kind of something new, that they had never experienced this kind of experience in their lives subjectively. That this almost seemed like a post-capitalist space in that sense. And you have this kind of description in Hong Kong as well regarding the umbrella movement months later. But I think what's also interesting is the kind of discourse which took place online during this time. There's so much kind of self-reflection online. You would have these ideas being discussed on PTT. You have people calling for actions, and then we realized in the occupation space just not too long after. PTT is an online forum that's similar to Reddit for people that don't know what it is. That's how some people compare it. And I think it's interesting too, because just the way that in the kind of artworks that appeared in the occupation space itself was a form of discourse. People were kind of discussing ideas, frameworks for understanding the movement just in this kind of artwork here. So for example, you'll have like, today if you don't stand up, then tomorrow like you won't be able to. Or you'll have like the discourse around the black box, this framing of it as a process of procedural injustice or lacking transparency on the part of government, or calling for targeting certain politicians or taking certain actions or whatever. That also is quite interesting, I think, about just the space that developed during the movement. You have the V from Vendetta from Occupy Wall Street, and that was popular in those years. And I think it really gave people a sense of empowerment. I mean, people, I think in the sense that suddenly it's people were living a moment of the spectacular. And so you would have, for example, experimental artistic performances taking place around the legislature. There's a kind of, I think, a resistance against the neoliberal disenchantment of the world that one could see in the movement. What I mean by that is that, for example, in the years prior to the movement, young people were seen as kind of struggling to get by on low salaries, facing no job prospects. There's a breakdown of these kind of longer traditional privileges people had within to work for companies for long term. People were working kind of floating between occupations. There are not a lot of low salaries under 22K for a college graduate. And young people are being kind of criticized as a weak strawberry generation, saying that they were kind of a soft, well, strawberry tribe is the proper translation, but kind of a weak, soft generation that's not as strong as, let's say, the boomers. But then there's also, this verdict really kind of inverted after the movement, and this is one of the effects of the movement. Young people are seen as kind of being creative, also willing to stand up for against injustice at great personal risk. And I think this was something that was quite new at the time. And also then one to see, for example, this return of tropes from the democracy movement, for example. there's this thing called a tradition at protests in Taiwan called a democracy sausage, where people come and grill sausage and sell them at protests. And you saw this during the movement. You had people that in the past, during the authoritarian era, there's a tradition of selling banned books at protests, for example. You had these kind of booksellers come out for that. And it's also, I think, people are really touched by some of the generosity of people during the movement. For example, just that they would provide free transport or transport for low cost between places for protest actions and so forth. You had an ad in the New York Times that's crowdfunded during this time, Democracy at 4 a.m. And so then with a lot of the, in past years, for example, trying to call attention to Taiwan's exclusion from the WHO and so forth, you will also have this kind of crowdfunding campaigns appear. And this phenomenon really traces itself back to the sunflower movement as a kind of precedent. And I think that then in the sense of empowerment young people had, you had this kind of reversal of the order of things. It is very carnivalesque in some sense, that there's that the kind of normal order in which politicians are very respected is slightly inverted. And so I thought a powerful symbol was the ROC flag, the official national flag, was turned upside down on top of the legislature during part of the movement. I think that's kind of, it points to kind of the transformation in dynamics, the reversal of the order of authority. And so suddenly then you'll have these politicians as mind here just being, depicted like this. He's suddenly Hitler. He's suddenly this like an antler-like deer creature. That comes from the fact that he had a gaffe, which is very strange, where he said that deer, that their antlers were hair growing out of their ears. And so that's obviously not the case. But people would make fun of the fact that the president of the country apparently believes this about deer. And so his last name is Ma as well, which is a homophone for horse. And so he'd be depicted as a horse, and as well as some kind of deer creature, some kind of horse deer creature thing, actually to black box. And so suddenly you have these politicians that are supposed to be respected in society, these authority figures, and suddenly they're not even human. They're just like these kind of weird creatures that people are laughing at. And some of it could be very vulgar actually too. I mean, look at this. So this is like, and there was, I mean, just for example, one of the popular protest slogans was, "I don't need sex, my government fucks me every day." And so there's this kind of vulgar side to the movement that was, sometimes actually kind of homophobic. Ma, for example, there was speculation that he could be a closeted gay, that he was having a relation with Jing Guzong, which is, his trusted aide. And yeah, it applies to other politicians as well. This is Wu Duanyi, who's depicted as a kind of dolphin creature. He said that in response to environmental protests, he said that the white dolphin has innate ability to make U-turns, and so that led to a nickname of General White Dolphin for him, because he himself makes U-turns politically, changing around his position. This is what I mentioned as well. But then it's also kind of interesting the visual reference by which protesters understood who they were, and so you have this kind of self-heroization of themselves. So you will have the analogy to Kono, which is a popular movie that was released during that time about a baseball team during the Japanese colonial period, Taiwanese baseball team that was viewed as a kind of multi-ethnic baseball team, and this was seen as kind of appointing this kind of multi-ethnic civic identity, the civic nationalist identity that these students maybe advocated or embodied. That they were maybe beyond these kind of long-standing distinctions between Huaixin and Benxin, between those that came to Taiwan with the KMT and those that have been here from earlier waves of migration, and also this movement included indigenous and so forth. And it was open to kind of outsiders that traditionally been excluded from Taiwan's identity movements, because when you're trying to build a nation or advocate for independence, that nation does have certain there's certain exclusions as to who's outside. And then you have a lot of references to anime. Just this is from Attack on Titan, the popular Japanese anime, which is also interesting because the sense of isolation and trying to fight against the world almost that you see in anime like that. There's a reason why that resonated, I think, with young people in Taiwan. And then you'll have just some very odd phenomenon too that occurred during the movement. For example, I think a lot of it's very mimetic is the word. For example, you'll have the Qiuyi, the KMT legislator, was angry because during the occupation of the executive branch, students broke into his office and ate sun cakes. And so then he also couldn't get the name of the movement right after that. He called it like the banana movement. And so you have mockery of him for that. I may be mixing up whose office it was. But anyways, after that, there was people started sending sun cakes to the legislature. And this was just like itself something that was very interesting to me, that just, that's what people did automatically. Just for example, Ling Feifan, the student leader, he had a green jacket and people would start buying that jacket. That jacket sold out. Chen Weiting, the other kind of prominent student leader, there was one time he was filmed hugging a bear when he was sleeping, and so people started buying bears and sending them to the legislator. And so there's some interesting phenomena in that sense. I don't know why this slide is blank. Oh, here's a picture of this. Yeah, people tell them that came up in this presentation as well. And so then the question after that is what happens to the movement after? And so, for example, there will be people that point to the movement and say Tsai Ing-wen's election victory is an outcome of this movement, that she rose to power on the basis of this movement. I think that we might disagree, but somewhat. It's somewhat overdetermined that this outcome would have possibly happened anyway. But she definitely did leverage on this very heavily in her advertising. For example, campaign ads were very much visually referenced the Sunflower Movement. Her campaign aesthetic was designed by Aaron Ye, who designed the Democracy at 4 a.m. ad. He's one of Taiwan's most famous designers at this point. And then, for example, there was a famous ad, a television ad, Walking with Children, that visually referenced a lot of these different causes that Sunflower Movement activists were concerned with, ranging from these kind of land eviction struggles in reality to even animal rights or concern with new immigrants or a rainbow flag appeared in that. And there's also criticism then of the DPP of kind of just harvesting this movement, kind of co-opting it and so forth, rejecting this kind of massive social energy towards this party machine and electoral aims. But then there's also different parties that came out of the movement, such as the New Power Party, which is the third party that came out of the movement, which was successful in winning seats in legislature in 2016. And there have been other third parties as well, which I'll leave to Lev to talk about. And so that's another legacy of the movement, that there was this wave of young people kind of creating parties and running for office and so forth. And the outcome of the movement is in that sense still up in the air, and I think we can talk a bit more about that later, but I'll pass it over to Lev now.
Thanks, Brian. So I'm going to talk about movement outcomes. So these are a lot of politicians that today are kind of regular features. Can everyone hear me? Am I loud? Are we loud enough? Okay. A lot of these spaces are now very typical in Taiwanese politics, and pretty much every single one got their start from the Sunflower Movement. And what I just very quickly want to talk about is what do we mean by outcomes? Us really boring political scientists, when we think about social movements, a lot of the times, did it work? Was it successful? That's a very fair question. But what success or failure means can often be tricky to conceptualize. And when you try to measure success, you kind of have to think about where and when we're talking about. So instead, we like to think of outcomes and think of it more what happened because of the movement, and try to leave this kind of empirical, was it good or bad or successful or unsuccessful, to kind of personal interpretation. So a couple of questions that I think are important to keep in mind. What does it mean for a movement to be successful, if that's a word that we like to use? How do movement outcomes beyond these ideas of success or failure still impact Taiwan today? And how can we think about and look for movement outcomes in short, medium, and long terms? Because arguably, there's lots of different things we can already point to and say that's because of Sunflower. At the same time, there's lots of stuff that hasn't happened yet that I'm sure 10 years from now we'll say, we could actually probably also trace that back to Sunflower. And it doesn't show up on this PowerPoint, but there's a picture in the background there. And this is one of my favorite pictures because it's Freddie Lim, Huang Guotang, and Ko En-che grilling steak together. Because once upon a time they were friends, and they're not friends anymore. And I'm going to talk a lot about that. But just very quickly, just to kind of emphasize, when we think of short-term outcomes, we might think of things like the government acknowledged Sunflower, and the withdrawal of CSSTA was in fact a very tangible outcome that we can see. Medium term, we see lots of political parties forming after Sunflower, and you see a lot of politicians entering shortly after Sunflower. And then when we think more long term, we can think more like co-optation of Sunflower forces. I actually totally agree that Tsai Ing-wen wrote on the Sunflower Movement to get elected in 2016. Co-optation has a very negative connotation, but really, I think if you look at it from a more empirical perspective, actually one of the most important facts about Sunflower that I think gets forgotten a lot is the DPP was actually completely in support of CSSTA, the trade agreement. They only changed to become in opposition to it after the Sunflower Movement broke out. And the part that they were opposed to, like Brian talked about, was only the part about it being passed in 30 seconds. The DPP wasn't in opposition to the contents of the bill. Now, that of course changed after the Sunflower Movement, and once the DPP kind of saw this massive potential force that they could, the word that gets used a lot is so good, to harvest this force. And arguably we've seen a lot of that, and that continues to happen today with kind of a lot of these former Sunflower activists now joining the DPP. So I'm gonna talk about one of these medium-term outcomes, this idea of new political parties forming, because this is really what my dissertation is about. And so two of the most kind of well-known parties that came out of Sunflower, one is called the New Power Party, and the other is called the Social Democratic Party. One of those became successful, and the other one did not. This was a article written about what's the third force going to do, help or hurt the DPP. And there's this great line at the bottom. You can't see it very well, but essentially says the author wasn't able to figure out why exactly these two parties split from each other and formed, but we're going to press on anyway. And that question of why did they form and why did they split is something that I find very interesting, and particularly important to understanding why today, because if you follow Taiwanese politics and you know who the New Power Party are, you often ask yourself, like, what happened to them? And we'll get there. But first, let's talk about where they actually came from. So this was a PowerPoint I gave a while ago. Pardon me for copy pasting. It's no longer a working paper either. It's out. Thank you. So this is the story of how these two parties went from the Sunflower movement to being in existence. This is the really boring slide in which I talk about what a movement party is. That's not really important, but I'll leave it up there for you to read for now. When we start with the history of the New Power Party and the Social Democratic Party, it actually traces back to someone named Lin Yixiong, who, if you're familiar with Taiwanese history, you probably know who he is. He's one of the most tragic figures from the democratization era. He's one of the very first Dangwai activists to ever run for local politics back in the 70s. And to fast forward, there's this moment in late 2013, about 6 months before the Sunflower movement. And keep in mind, 6 months before the Sunflower movement, no one knew that the Sunflower movement was coming. One of the activists that I work with, they put it as it was a bad time. People were not happy with how the world of Taiwan was going. They legitimately thought that the KMT was going to re-win in 2016. People did not have a lot of faith in the DPP to really do anything about it, because the DPP had just had 4 years of really bad electoral politics following Chen Shui-bian scandal. And activists were not particularly stoked on giving the DPP power to try to fix things, because it really didn't seem like they were very good at doing that in late 2013. So Lin Yixiong, along with a lot of lawyers, activists, academics, they started very loosely talking about this idea of we should do something about this. We're not really sure what we're going to do, but we should do something. And they start this organization called Gongminzuhe, the Taiwan Citizens Union. Now, the TCU was not a political party, but they wanted to maybe become a political party. They had a lot of thoughts about what exactly they were going to do. Ideologically speaking, they're all pro-independence. They're all progressive left-leaning, and they all had a history of social activism. Who exactly was in this organization was very, very, very loose. This was, sometimes you would have a handful of lawyers and academics come, and then the next week it would be just activists. And it was so loose that they actually really struggled to get anything done. One of the very first problems that they faced was that word got around that this thing happened, and the Green Party, which plug for a political scientist named Daffet Fell, who just put out a new book on Taiwan's Green Party, which is super interesting. But part of the Green Party's history is actually involved with the TSU, because, TCU, that's a typo. The Green Party approached this organization and said, you should join us and give us this kind of energy you're gathering. And the TCU said no. Because what they found out was that a lot of these existing pro-independence and kind of pan-green parties were really, really difficult to work with. For example, are we familiar with the Taiwan Solidarity Union, the TSU? They're also a pro-independence party that existed in 2013. The TCU did not work well with them, and they had a lot of struggles trying to get a lot of kind of coherent solidarity between pan-green forces together. And essentially what happens is this organization stalls and nothing happened. And then Sunflower Movement happens. And all of a sudden, this organization is like, oh my gosh, the moment is here. And during Sunflower itself, the TCU was not particularly involved. They were all there, but they were very careful because they did not want to seem like they were co-opting what was going on. They wanted to make it very clear that they weren't, capitalizing on the moment, especially when so many Sunflower activists were very concerned about the public perception of the movement. Now, after the movement ends, they're like, all right, this is it. The party's going to form. But it didn't go very well. And what happened is the TCU broke up into essentially two factions, one run by a man named Michael Lin and one by Lin Fengzheng. And the second faction run by Fan Yun and the other by a political scientist named Chen Xiangzhi. These two factions would eventually become the New Power Party and the Social Democratic Party. Perhaps one of the most unknown facts about these parties is that they both come from the same organization. But for a lot of reasons, these two factions could not find mutual ground to start a party together. And as a result, we ended up getting a split here, and now we have the New Power Party and the Social Democratic Party. If you're interested in reading the whole story, the paper is available. I'm happy to email it to you. While I'm self-promoting, I have another paper about activists and the DPP during Sunflower, but we'll talk about that later. So what happened to these third parties all these years later? It's complicated. So, when we think about why did the NPP and SDP initially successfully form and initially run in elections and then later fall apart, there's a lot of different dimensions that we need to consider. First is what happened after they formed. So when you think about the NPP and the SDP, the first thing that happened almost immediately after their formation was the 2016 election. And what you see with the NPP in particular is a very close relationship with the DPP. Because again, in 2016, the DPP realized that they needed to get on board this Sunflower train. And they did really well. So much so that as time gone on, I would argue the DPP got better at being a Sunflower-esque party than the NPP did. And it's really that change that the DPP learned a lot of the tricks from Sunflower in terms of what gets young people excited, who they ought to recruit, what kind of faces ought to be forward. The NPP started out well, but things changed. So this is another project that I'm working on right now about the very in-depth specifics about the New Power Party, and I'm happy to answer questions if you have them later. But essentially, when we think about the NPP today, what we see is a party that started out as a Sunflower activist party, and a lot of its members are still based from the Sunflower movement. The biggest difference is that the relationship between third force parties and the DPP has become much more complicated. Mostly because a lot of the initial areas that the third force was able to market themselves as more pro-Taiwan sovereignty, as more progressive, as parties that are not going to rely on Zheng Er-dai or as second-generation politicians, but actually push forward these new, fresh faces who have experience in social activism. The NPP did that less and less as time went on, and the DPP did that more and more as time went on. So if we look, I think like my favorite example is someone like Lai Pingyu from the DPP. Her emergence as a politician is very much contingent on the NPP losing its footing. So for example, Lai Pingyu was elected in Xizhi. That's the same district that Huang Guotang from the NPP was elected. Now, because the NPP made a lot of missteps during their first term, Huang Guotang was no longer really able to run in that district. And because of the NPP's failing, it created an opportunity for the DPP to nominate an activist in his stead. And now with her election, the DPP seems to be the party that is promoting young activists more so than the NPP. So when we think about Sunflower's legacy, I recommend that we think broadly. And these ideas of successes and failures, they're going to become apparent more over time, and they're not always going to seem obvious right away. And when we think about kind of, what after Sunflower really mattered and kind of tracing its importance back to the movement, it's bigger than any one person, piece of legislature, party, politician. There's way more different layers to thinking about why the Sunflower movement mattered and where it mattered beyond just even necessarily formal politics. A lot of new studies coming out about the Sunflower Movement focus on more than just, say, political science or sociology, but look much more broadly at youth culture, online activism, and the ways that Sunflower really kind of changed how Taiwanese approach politics. I'm going to stop there. I know I went through this fairly quickly, but I wanted to end before 8 so that we had time for Q&A. So thank you. And I think we're happy to answer whatever questions you have.
Yeah, so I think we can have a Q&A next. So I think it's good to have a kind of interactive discussion and so forth. And yeah, feel free to ask anything. I can take hands. Yes.
Really quickly, how would you compare the rise of the TPP and its formation, and compare that to the formation of the MPP, and how it's kind of like a third-party force that wants to bring change to this two-party system?
Great question.
Can you repeat the question for my screen?
Yeah, of course. So how do we understand the TPP, its rise, and kind of in comparison to the NPP? Say again?
Repeat the question, please.
Yes, I am repeating the question. Oh, no worries. How does the NPP compare to the formation of the NPP, TPP and the NPP, and as kind of this new third-party-ish option to Taiwanese politics? It's a very good question. So Ko-Wenja, once upon a time, we all thought he was pan-green, and it turns out he's not. That's a long story short. And you know, there's something very particular about the TPP, the Taiwan People's Party.
Yeah, that's right. Taiwan People's Party.
Thank you.
Not Trans-Pacific Partnership.
If only there was a TPP for Taiwan, that would have been so much better. Ko-Wenja, unlike say the NPP or the SDP, when he started his party, one of the biggest differences is that he was not starting new. Most people that ended up joining the TPP were already established politicians from the KMT, from the DPP, and that matters in the really exciting world of party politics, political science. When we think about whether or not a party is new or not, my resident political scientist friend in the front row got excited there. Whether or not a party is starting out with capital or not capital, whether financial capital, really makes a difference to what extent a party can succeed. And the TPP was going in with a lot, especially once they got the cosign from Terry Go. Perhaps the biggest major difference is that the TPP tries really hard not to seem like it stands for, I don't want to say it doesn't stand, it tries hard not to seem like it stands for anything. But they've not made it particularly clear what exactly their policies are, except bits and traces of Ko-Wenja saying these very light blue things. Big close partners like Hong Kong, being very open to places like Shanghai and Shanghai. And it doesn't help that a lot of the politicians that Ko-Wenja has recruited are more light blue leaning than they are green. So, you know, the TPP is not so much a third force party in the same way as the NDP and SDP because it's on a different part of the political spectrum. So are they offering another option? They are, but they're offering more of another option to light blue voters than necessarily to kind of the pan-green voters that a lot of sunflower movements are a part of. Brian, I'm sure you would love to.
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting too because the rise of the third force, quote unquote, the parties such as the NPP and the SDP that arose after the sunflower movement was also shaped by the rise of Ko-Wenja. After his won in 2014 as an independent, not running as a candidate of any party, backed by the DPP, which he won their nomination, but claiming to be kind of steering his own course. He claimed to be a candidate beyond pan-blue, pan-green distinction, beyond blue and green. That rhetoric kind of really stuck, and people spoke of his path to victory as a quote-unquote co-model at that point in time. And so I think a lot of the NPP and SDP were also looking at that as kind of a sort of template. And in that sense, I think it's interesting because it points to, again, one of the after effects of the sunflower movement is that every party out there wants, under the sun basically now, wants to seem as though it's a movement party. The KMT, for example, in the years after, did also try these different acts such as storming the legislature more than once, such as regarding the opposition to pension reforms and so forth. Regarding the actual main pork issue now that's currently being voted, they're also kind of using this kind of sort of sunflower-esque rhetoric, trying to make this into their version of sunflower movement, trying to win the support of young people by having this cause that just wins and gets the support of people. In that sense, Ko is interesting because his party was composed of people that were kind of already out there. They have their own interests. I think the question is really, I think, eventually down the line, will this party always be determined by him, or will the people in the party have their own kind of agendas at stake? And I think that's the question. And they're all kind of they couldn't get beyond their superstars. Someone like Wang Guochang dominated the party, and then he kind of would unexpectedly turn on the party, and he didn't prove to be as effective as a leader as I think people really had hoped, and that kind of led to a lot of the downfall of the party. If he had, for example, determined more quickly whether the party would endorse Tsai Ing-wen or not, then perhaps the party would not have split in this kind of way. And so I think this personality cult is very integrated into Chinese politics, and so it's a stumbling block to third parties.
But to put a finer point on it, I would not describe the TPP as a movement party. It didn't start out of a social movement. Cohen just started out of a social movement, but one person is not a party. His party itself came much more from well-established politicians and financial donors.
When last did either of you talk to Freddie then? Because I worked on a documentary about him that's now 5 years ago. And so he was in the party, was super enthusiastic, he was super idealist, and what happened? Yeah.
So I have a whole 30-page long research paper all about that question coming out. So we didn't see, the NPP wrote a lot of hype for the first until 2018, arguably. And it was only after 2018 that rumors and whispers about not everything being so peaceful at home started to leak out. What we didn't see was that a lot of those very complicated relationships within the party started almost immediately. And even though you have this, this is not real. Arguably, even when this was taken, referring back to the era of when Freddie had a ponytail Freddie did not get along with Wang Guochang very early on. Now, it's not just the NPP's problems are more than just Wang Guochang and Freddie. That is a big problem, but it's not the only problem. And it got to the point where essentially Freddie asked himself the question, like, am I going to spend all of my time trying to make this party work, or am I going to try to win my re-election? And when it came to 2020, again, this is a long story short. When it came to 2020, Freddie made the decision that focusing on his re-election was more important than trying to make the NPP work in 2020. A lot of us remember the very, very messy situation of politicians leaving the NPP. Not just leaving, but someone like, oh my goodness, I'm going to totally blank on her name. She was she was nominated by Freddie in Taipei, and then she dropped out after she reached an accord with the DPP, because at the time the NPP had not officially decided its relationship with the DPP in 2020. Things like that really kind of pushed Freddie to a point where it was a question of, what's more important for me right now. Speaking of the DPP being really freaking smart, they saw Freddie leave the NPP and they jumped on that. Now, he didn't join the party, but they sure courted the heck out of him. And Freddie agreeing to work with the DPP most certainly hurt the NPP, of course, but it helped Freddie and the DPP a lot, especially in 2020.
Yeah, I think to add to that, I mean, this is literally his election district that we're in here, and he's like right across the street. His office is literally like across the street, so I see him on the street sometimes. But I think the issue is actually then local presence for these kind of younger politicians that came out of the Sunflower movement. Oftentimes they're perceived as, for example, focus on national level issues, but not actually building up local issues. And so they're not, they're criticized as not being an area, not being very deeply rooted in the area. There's also this tension, I think, between younger politicians that came out of the movement and traditional politics, quote unquote. And for example, there's the long-standing practice of going to weddings and funerals and waving off buses, tour buses, that sort of thing, and greeting all these people at funerals and weddings that you don't even know and acting like you know them. This was something that a lot of younger politicians really wanted to get out of. they also did not really want to rely on the kind of traditional fighting over resources of advertising, just using all these billboards everywhere that cost money and that sort of thing, using the internet and so forth. But then, what happens actually is then that a lot of these younger politicians were perceived by local constituents as thinking they are above them, just not thinking they have to go through these traditional political means. And so that became damaging later on. And so, for example, in this area, observing that, Freddie did actually have to come, switch to more focus on traditional advertising, going around on these loudspeaker buses and shouting your name, waving, and that sort of thing. And it's true of every politician. For example, the SDP also face these issues. There was some criticism of them initially before 2016 because they said they would not do that. Eventually, they did have to do these things, such as riding on the loudspeaker bus and so forth.
Speaking of, yeah.
I can just quickly add.
Please.
In our film, there's a scene where Freddie is like at some temple and he's, talking to the people there and so on. And he's telling them what he wants to do. And one of the guys says, "Oh, you should go into politics. You should run for the legislature."
It's also important to remember that Freddie's decision to leave the NPP, when did he do that? Because even though 2020 was a huge success and we all remember it really fondly, what we forget is a year before January 2020, when Hong Guoyu was first coming out, and we're middle 2019, and at the end, Tsai Ing-wen's up here, Hong Guoyu's down here. But mid-2019, Hong Guoyu's way up here, and Tsai Ing-wen is way down here. And Freddie in Wanhua at the time, not polling well. And that's why he had to decide. Because, back then, I know we remember 2020 very fondly, but a year before 2020, man, things were not great.
Yeah, I think the other thing I would add is the third parties, they oftentimes do need the nomination of the DPP, for example. Just running on your own, and sometimes that doesn't work. You also do need to be backed sometimes by the resources of the DPP, because smaller parties do have less resources. And so that raises issues, because these are parties that are implicitly founded on the promise to be not of the pan-green camp in this way, not just to be kind of a smaller, younger brother of the DPP or whatever, to be something different. But then why are you relying on that? And so I think that's another question. With growth in parties, here's the criticism, maybe they have diverted from their original ideals.
And plans change. Another very important case is so Funyun founded did not agree on whether or not to work with the DPP. Now, remember, in 2016, the NPP did work with the DPP very closely. Funyun did not want to work with the DPP in 2016. That was one of the reasons they split. The irony that Funyun would later leave her party to join the DPP, when you ask people who are very involved in the TCU, people are just kind of like mind blown that ended up happening. So, plans change.
Any other question?
Yeah.
We can take it next. Yeah, back there.
Hi, Sam. Hi, Sam.
Yeah.
Hi, thanks for your talk. Lev, you ended your talk by saying, when we're thinking of the implications, we should think broadly and think outside of party politics. So I'm wondering how either of you think about these broader, not necessarily party political implications of the Sunflower.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because a lot of people are very dismissive of the movement now. I mean, just holding an event like this, I think people will be like, "Why are you still talking about this?" 7 years later, because there's a view that has been co-opted, or that this is kind of a very expired, thing that just people keep, taking out as though it's something to build credibility off of, but then it's become this kind of like corpse that people are still whipping or whatever. And I think that. So I think that the interesting thing is that though that's the question I think of any social movement. Does it resolve only in intellectual outcomes, or are there other shifts you can point to? And I think it's very important to point to these kind of discursive shifts that young people were viewed as hopeless before the movement, but now such focus on young people. I think also it's very hard for us to imagine now this kind of sense of apocalypse, the sense of just that of doom that existed for the Sunflower and how much that changed. I think that we've seen a lot of kind of products appear from the movement that are not just party politics based. I mean, just a lot of organizations, NGOs, startups, just groups, civil society groups, and that sort of thing.
And I think one way that it doesn't impact as much as we think. So I'll shout out to Shelley Rigger, who's a political scientist who also studies Taiwan domestic politics. So she was here on Fulbright with me last year, and she did a research experiment on what we call like the Sunflower generation. But she was looking at specifically people between the ages of 17 and 23. So arguably Gen Z, not millennials. Because the assumption, or at least the research question she had, was that Sunflower, this thing, mobilized everyone after the Sunflower movement. And what she finds after doing like hundreds and hundreds of group discussions with people between the ages of 17 and 23 is people aren't mobilized like Sunflower activists were. There's a major generational split between Taiwanese millennials and Taiwanese Gen Z. And arguably, I think there's research to be done, but I would make the claim that it's largely because of the Sunflower movement, and that Gen Z were not really around for the Sunflower movement, and the millennials were. And this was very mobilizing in terms of bringing a political consciousness to Taiwanese millennials in a way that at least Shelley's research shows didn't necessarily transition over to Gen Z.
I think another interesting thing is that there are a lot of networks that developed in the years up to 2014, for example, out of these different single issue movements. Like those networks basically don't exist anymore because they're all kind of uprooted by the sunflower movement and destroyed or channeled towards electoral politics. And so that's another thing that doesn't really exist anymore for I think people who are younger.
Ellie, please.
Hi, so again, amazing talk, super interesting. Thanks so much for being here. But my question is, why do you, in you guys' perception, what pushed people to kind of go over the edge from just like, I don't know, tweeting or like writing some blogs or like standing outside the parliament with some fucking angry signs and shit, to like actually breaking into the legislative yuan and like going that extra step to be that pissed off? Like, what do you think was the change? And then, yeah, I'm super curious about that. Your perspective. Thank you.
Sorry, can you repeat the question so that out there can hear?
Oh yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I keep forgetting to do that.
I know.
So the question is, what led people to go to that step of, for example, going as far as to break into the legislature? Like, what led to that, and not just, for example, posting on social media and so forth? I think it's just a hard question to answer. I think just that between 2008 and 2014, just the atmosphere socially was just very different. It seemed like on every front there would be some new thing to protest every like month. Like there'd be some new eviction case, or there'd be like some anti-nuclear demonstration, or some clash with police. That kind of, and also that doesn't really take place now. I think what developed also is this kind of sociality between young activists, and I also think that those networks, that kind of personal networks, social networks that exist across Taiwan, that also no longer exist now. Just like people got to know each other the years before the Sunflower Movement from participating in these different single issue movements. Developed trust networks. It became also hanging out. It was cool to be political among these people. That was your kind of network of friends. And that's continued to some extent. I mean, you can actually point to certain groups that got to know each other and in actions, and they became certain sort of like, you could say, factions, or mini factions within politics. It's interesting, for example, just people that participated in the attempted occupation of the executive branch during 324, they all ended up in the DPP. Whereas, the people that were kind of in the legislature, they probably end up in the NPP. Those kind of connections are also kind of interesting. But I think that then that's another contributor to that, there's this a large mass of people participating. And you don't see it now, so it's very hard to imagine backwards, but
I tell everyone who's interested in the Sunflower Movement that if you want to understand the Sunflower Movement, you can't look at the Sunflower Movement in a vacuum. And that you really need to understand the context leading up to it. Because, obviously the key grievances from Sunflower were very specifically about CSSTA, lack of transparency, this question of black box politics. But so much led up to them becoming politicized to the point that they would care about those things. Anti-media monopoly and Wild Strawberry in particular are super important. You have to know those two movements at the very least, if not also Wild Lily, to understand why exactly the people who pushed for Sunflower were there. So specifically, Chen Weiting, Huang Guotang, and even Daifan, actually, I think all three of them were definitely at anti-media monopoly. If not, they were the ones in charge of anti-media monopoly. So Sunflower wasn't even their first rodeo. They had already gotten very used to organizing social protests by that point. So you really have, a long history of activist networks that were learning a lot and really growing for years. And then Sunflower was just kind of like the perfect storm of like, this is it, this is the big one, and it became that.
Yeah, when I interviewed Jiho Chang, who was a Zilong City Councilor, he had a interesting metaphor. He said that it was like the Marvel movies, like it was had the different Marvel movies, like one, different like Iron Man, like Captain America, whatever, and Sunflower was like Endgame or something like that. But I think also what's interesting is that I'm not, in retrospect it does seem like that, but I'm not actually sure, at the time we felt that, for example, just because it just seemed like another cause, and then this one became big. I actually feel that perhaps there could have been a different triggering incident than the CSST, for example. There could have been some other issue that provoked a movement on that scale. And I think also what was different about Sunflower qualitatively than other movements, that the population at large kind of rallied behind people. I mean, it could be contingent because of just the fact that there was an occupation of legislature. This had not happened before, or other factors. But, this was the time in which it did balloon from several hundred people in the beginning outside of the legislature, like a, average protest or whatever, to something that was massive with, 500,000 people, around like 2% of the population on the streets of Taipei by May 30th, about 2 weeks later.
This might be a big question, but so as we're looking at some of the trends and developments post-Sunflower, I'm wondering what kind of impacts were felt beyond our island here. And I'm talking like beyond cross-strait and beyond Taiwan, US. So regionally, globally even.
So thank you for your question. To repeat it, yes, I remember. When we think about kind of impacts of sunflower, where else do we see the impact beyond just Taiwan or beyond cross-strait relations? All right. So the most obvious one to me is Hong Kong, because sunflower came before umbrella, and a lot of umbrella inspiration came from sunflower. And that inspiration from sunflower in Hong Kong lasts beyond just umbrella. I think back to when Fan Songjong started in Hong Kong and they broke into the legislature, they wrote, what did they write?
Sunflower HK.
Sunflower HK, thank you. And very obvious reference. Really what I see sunflower as, it's a major moment for the building of a new Taiwan-Hong Kong solidarity. And we see this very concretely with movement parties that form out of the umbrella movement. Demosisto, in particular, Joshua Wong's political party, they literally flew to Taiwan to meet with the NPP to learn about how they ran their movement party. The connections are incredibly obvious. Now, of course, that's also a much more complicated story because Demosisto's rise is a little bit different from the NPP. But at the very least, you definitely see major links between Hong Kong and Taiwan forming, and I think arguably that's one of the most important other ways to look for sunflower's impact.
Yeah, it's interesting because it happens very early on. In the month after sunflower, I think it was July or August, there was an attempted occupation of the Legislative Council of Hong Kong regarding development in the new territories. I mean, this is before umbrella movement. It fizzled out, it becomes a big thing, but they tried that tactic. It was probably an imitation. Look at Demosisto too. A lot of their aesthetic is, just even design-wise, is very much NDP-like. They do use slogans even like 100% freedom of speech, which is taken from Den Nanrong it's the Taiwan Free Speech Warden that self-immolated himself. And in Hong Kong today, they're using the term white terror to describe the present circumstances. Like, why is it white terror? It's a term from Taiwan. They're up against the CCP, which claims red as its color. And so why are you claiming white terror? And then I think regionally, though, one can point to other social movements. For example, in Japan, there was a protest against Article 9, and in South Korea, there was a protest against the Park administration. So I think there are two frameworks that one can situate sunflower in within the 10 years. Oh my God, 10 years. 2020. Like Occupy, the kind of occupation style movements after 2011, it's a tactical thing. It's oftentimes related to this framework of neoliberalism and economic inequality. But then you also have these movements that are popping up among young people in Asia that are often related to the China issue directly in the years around 2014. So Sunflower, Umbrella, the SEALs issue, because it's about revisions of the Japanese constitution to basically allow the Japanese army, de facto army, to be able to fight wars legally because there's a threat of China. And young people are protesting against this as a resurgence of militarism, for example, which does raise also the comparison to Taiwan, with the KMT and so forth. Also, these kind of social movement leaders do kind of know each other. I mean, as you talk to the student leaders of Taiwan, Hong Kong, Thailand, Japan, and
Thailand especially.
Yeah, they also know each other. More recently we have the kind of milk tea framing with the different protests in Thailand, Myanmar, linking that to Hong Kong and Taiwan. That comes after. That comes way after. But even just in the years after, this is kind of after effects of the movement in that sense, I think. But people don't usually point to that. Next question.
Please.
Sorry, you said that you think that the sunflower movement could easily have been triggered by some other issue, but it actually seems like most of the larger movements on the scale of the sunflower movement in Taiwan have always historically been triggered by sort of an anti-Chinese issue, one sort of another. That's just like sort of all party politics. So you actually, I guess I'm wondering what your thoughts are on about like sort of social movements and just sort of politics in Taiwan still being constrained by sort of cross-strait issues.
You go first.
Okay. So the question was just regarding my comments that, for example, could the sunflower movement have been triggered by something else? Because historically in Taiwan, things are triggered by something to do with China. And my answer is, I was saying that specifically about the CSSTA. It could have been another thing to do with China that could have provoked the movement. Not necessarily this trade deal, for example. Because you actually do, I did for my website, the World History Archive of Sunflower, I talked to a lot of people, and what are their thoughts on the CSSTA? And not everyone can answer the fine details of this trade agreement. Not everyone knows about what it means, except that it has to do with China. You talk to an average person in the streets during the movement, I'm sure they didn't know the details of this trade agreement. I think another tricking issue with China could have been possible.
Something I argue in my research is that different kinds of threats from China affect Taiwan differently. A very basic comparison might be like, there's fighter jets flown over the Taiwan Strait every day. No one cares. Which there's a lot of reasons why no one really cares. We're used to it. But China finding a way to threaten Taiwan through its own democratic institutions, that causes a mobilizing effect that other types of threat don't. So, if it wasn't CSSTA, I think something in comparison like anti-media monopoly, which was not a trade bill, but it was another kind of way for China to be able to access Taiwan's institutions without having to use any sort of like military threat. And I think arguably that has a different kind of effect on whether or not, or when and why sometimes activists mobilize over threats and other times they don't.
I guess my question was, do you see any hope in movement being triggered by, sort of more traditional left around economics, labor, whatever, environment, or are we still sort of bound by the issue of China?
So the question, the follow-up question was, what are the hopes for a more leftist mobilization over issues like labor, economics? Do you want to go first?
Yeah, I think probably not. I just think it's I think even just the way that these economic discontents which were present in the movement, and a factor in young people being willing to protest is social inequality. It's still within this kind of China framework, and so kind of return to that. And so I think it's actually very difficult to get beyond the independence unification frame. And even then, I think looking at the third parties after Sunflower, they all had this rhetoric of going beyond traditional independence unification politics, and I think they all failed at that at the end of the day.
Yeah. I mean, some people try to argue that Sunflower was an anti-neoliberal movement, and I don't really agree. Because people weren't against trade; they were just against trade with China, and there's no judgment on that statement. It's just more kind of a reality of what the movement actually was doing. When you look at more traditional groups in Taiwan, like if those who are unaware, there actually is a labor party in Taiwan. They're just pro-unification. Now, to articulate why that's a problem, if you are Sunflower activists. And a group comes to you saying we should care about class and trade and the conditions of workers, and they're also pro-China, you're not going to want to work with them. And that creates a very major barrier in Taiwan to actually having a kind of realized left collectivist consciousness of caring about things like things like class and the such, because it's just really difficult to kind of connect kind of existing labor groups in Taiwan who tend to have a very romanticized version of China in their minds and activists.
Yeah, I think what I would say though is that there was increased discussion of what it would mean for a pro-independence left after the movement, and this is forgotten. There were like these kind of debates about, for example, should you first emphasize left-wing politics, then independence, or vice versa, first independence politics, then left-wing politics. And that was a kind of debate that came up during that time. There's also a new focus on labor. You did have kind of increasing splits between the pro-unification and pro-independence left after that. But it didn't become the master narrative. And I think what's interesting too is that, one of the massive movements that occurred after Sunflower was protests against the changes to the Labor Standards Act by the Tsai administration. And that involved, a lot of the Sunflower activists. You had people like
NPP protested for that.
That's right. NPP took a very strong stance regarding that. That was a major factor in the split between Huang and Freddie. But even someone like Khai-Káng, who later became a DPP councillor, was there at the protests, for example, like fighting the riot police then. And later on, she became a DPP legislator. It was really the panic after 2018 elections when the KMT seemed like it was resurgent that led to people joining the DPP. So that was another way in which there was not an ability to escape from the independence unification frame.
So I think a lot was discussed about how the DPP was able to learn lessons and tactics from MPP. So let's talk about the other party. What lessons did the KMT learn or not learn from the Sunflower movement?
Great question. So the question was, the DPP learned a lot from the NPP and Sunflower, but what did the KMT learn from Sunflower?
Yeah.
I just like Racto pork is still in my mind, and I just think of like the KMT's occupation of the legislature while like throwing pickups all over the place. And,
it's like there's more than one too. The pension reform issue is the first time they tried to occupy the legislature, and then the Racto pork issue is another. Here's the legislators being there and just refusing to leave. But both were very farcical. I mean, they were literally. It's interesting too because there were literally deaths during the anti-pension reform. One. Like there was, there's old soldiers that were supposed to be paid pensions from the government. The KMT promised generous pensions to people in the army as a reward for political loyalty during the authoritarian period, and the Tsai administration is reforming the pension system so it doesn't become bankrupt. Well, so these old soldiers, are demanding respect. Like they would actually say, society doesn't respect us anymore. They need to, return to authoritarian values, really. And so there, there was one guy who tried to like climb up and he fell, and his like, buddies came over and they shook him and he died because when you fall, you're not supposed to like move that person. Also, former army personnel should know this. I don't know why they did that. So it was farcical. But then, this did not become like a massive triggering incident. Like, again, like there were literally deaths. It could have become something big, but it didn't. It just does not resonate. I think the KMT oftentimes was putting the cart before the horse, not having an issue to mobilize around, but just imitating tactics. And so just invading the legislature, trying to emphasize online advertising, but not really getting there.
So I would describe it as this. Tactics are not positions. Tactics are just ways that we articulate positions. And the KMT has looked at the tactics, but not realized that just staging a protest or just staging an occupation is not a sufficient condition to get people to care or join your side. And that kind of makes them very difficult to really justify them as like similar to what the NPP or DPP or Sunflower did, is just because from a position perspective, the politics are radically different. They thought that if we use the same tactics, that's the key to winning support, and we know that's not true.
Yeah, I mean, there's even like books written by political scientists just analyzing the movement, and it's like they have really bizarre views of it. I mean, they view it as like a DPP conspiracy that's organized behind the scenes. So they really did seem to believe that, actually. So I think they thought it was something they could also orchestrate, something similar.
Catherine.
Oh yeah. So one thing I thought was really interesting is when I think Brian, you talked about like the social movement networks that existed and that people kind of built on. And you talked about Shelley Rager's research on how the younger people now are not as mobilized. So if the triggering reasons tend to be China related, if there was something new that was China related, would there be potential right now for a new strong social movement in Taiwan, or is the potential just not there?
So the other thing I argue in my research. Oh yeah, sorry. So thank you. If the networks that are no longer really present in Sunflower, like Ryan talked about, and younger people, kind of Gen Z Taiwanese, are not as mobilized, then if China was to do some sort of other CSSTA style thing, would there be another protest? The reason I say no is because one of the main features of Taiwan that are different today from 2014 is the DPP was not seen as a viable party vehicle. Activists had no faith in the DPP. The DPP was in favor of the thing that everyone was panicked about. And arguably today, the DPP is really cool right now. And it wasn't cool before, and that really matters because people protest against the DPP because they feared that there was no one else that was going to be able to save them from China. And right now, people really feel like the DPP is doing a good job at stopping China from taking over Taiwan. So arguably, if there is some sort of major infiltration of China in Taiwan, I don't think the DPP has the bad reputation that they had in 2014. Arguably, they would be able to capitalize on their really popular support right now and reassure people that you don't need to protest, we got this.
Yeah, I would effectively say the same thing. That if there was something like that now, with the energy redirected towards the party apparatus of the DPP, I think what's interesting, I mean, just when I did my interviews for the Daybreak Project, I asked everyone, would you want another movement like the Sunflower movement? And the usual answer that I got from all the people I asked, who oftentimes were people that became politicians, it would be that no, we don't want this to happen because that means something is really wrong. The Sunflower movement was a crisis response. It was an emergency mechanism, pulling on the brakes to get things to stop. And so, just because you don't want things to be that bad for another movement to happen. But regarding the kind of the disruption of the networks, I think what's interesting is that after a movement, there's always an attempt to create structure. There's massive energy, spontaneous energy in a movement that's redirected in all these directions. There's so much, spontaneous activity being organized, libraries, people doing like ferrying people around, mental health, they provide services, whatever, and that's what goes somewhere. So people try to create institutions after the movement, such as political parties, that's one, creating NGOs, civil society organizations. And so Taiwan has a long-standing history of this happening. That after a movement, going back to, for example, Wild Lily in 1990, people start creating NGOs. And so there's an ability to, and civil society organizations, there's an ability to pass on experience that way to kind of politicize the younger generation through that. And there was a wave of that after the Sunflower movement, but this will take longer time. It's not the case anymore that I think that there are campus-based networks, so that there's a kind of activist student group on every campus, and they knew each other, doing reading groups and things like that all the time. Just the activist coffee shops that exist in Taipei. There's like a lot of them in the past. Most are gone now, and so that's kind of dissolved. And so that's a bit of a shift, I think.
Someone who's outside, yes.
I was wondering. There have been a lot of comparisons, especially to like Wild Lily and Hong Kong, which notably in both those situations, legislative electoral politics were much, much less healthy than Taiwan's were at the time of the Sunflower movement. So I was wondering, among activists, you spoke in response to one question on the legislative occupation, but how sort of activists have, in the aftermath of this movement, justified the occupation of the legislature, and critics have responded to as sort of a very slippery tactic that, as like you see the KMT is, can be used by one's opponents, not beyond just not just as a protest mechanism, not just like a stand in an occupying square, but as almost a subversion of electoral politics and the election that happened a few years prior. You mentioned also the in favor of
I can respond.
Oh, repeat the question.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, the question was, how did people justify the movement? In light of comparisons to Wildly and Umbrella, like how did people justify an occupation of the legislature as legitimate when it's actually overturning, for example, quote unquote democratic processes? And so it's interesting too because it came up in the rhetoric movement. There's a reason why the students, for example, really played at being nice, cleaning up everything and being respectable and whatever, just taking care of themselves and not trying to present that they're not these, drug users in the legislature having wild sex as the rumors were in the media and sort of whatever. And so there's this kind of emphasis on then winning political legitimacy in that sense. And I think then the claim is that this is an emergency mechanism because the democratic processes had gone wrong. You would do something like this. But then there's also the claim to say that, well, we're actually kind of more democratic than the way the legislature is running things, that we're voting on things. They were holding these kind of back then there's almost these kind of like Occupy Wall Street style General Assembly type things near the end of the movement. And that was even one of the demands within the movement that this needs to be mandated as a decision-making mechanism within government regarding discussing this bill to do that. And so there's that attempt to kind of say that we want to create these new processes to make things more democratic. I think then that's the thing that critics would level up at the movement or any movement that involves occupying. This is disrupting the electoral processes of government, and this was the rhetoric that came to use for sure.
Agreed. I think just the only thing to point to is some of the challenges that activists post Sunflower most certainly faced are, for example, Lin Feifan joined the DPP, and a lot of people in the DPP were not happy about that because Lin Feifan made a lot of his activist career criticizing the DPP, and specifically saying how wrong they were for supporting CSSTA, etc. And then for him to join the party at such a high position really is kind of it's made his political career more difficult than say someone who didn't do that.
I think also to add, there's still ongoing legal charges against people that participated in these different actions. So a lot of the charges against people that participated in the legislative branch occupation were dropped. There's some charges still against people that participated in the executive branch. And so it's interesting too, because then that comes up, like, do you actually put these people in jail or, have some charge against them when they even joined the ruling party, for example? And I think that then this is further complicated because these cases are still ongoing, 6 years later, but then things are getting so much worse in Hong Kong. Now things look really bad if you're like arresting people for something they did 6 years ago. And it, makes Taiwan seem as though there's no difference, for example. So,
7 people were sent to jail this year for Sunflower.
Yeah.
That happened. Oh. From up top, Maggie.
So Beijing pushing a CSSTA is like the least of my concerns, right? I'm not going to wake up and be like, oh my gosh, when is that trade push coming from Beijing, right? So we're in a much different place right now. And part of Shelley Rigger's work was asking Gen Z, because I think Gen Alpha starts about 2010, about their views towards the ROC. I know, the ROC, I got 2 Alphas. It's about like if you see an ROC flag, maybe it's not your preferred flag, but you feel pride that it's still representing where you're from. And then I look at like we now know working on like resilience training, which could be because it's an earthquake, could be because of something else, right? Do you see any hope for that energy to be channeled into military service, which is really what Taiwan needs to be a hedgehog, porcupine, choosier, not really ferocious creature, but has a coating that's hard to get through. So that's something that really needs to happen. Is there any hope for that happening?
The question was, is there any hope today to inspire young people, Gen Z or millennials, but not the alphas, about if there's any hope to kind of mobilize them to support military service and kind of a national defense?
Yeah, I think it's quite unlikely. That's the interesting thing. So this is one of the interesting paradoxes. I mean, just the military is still perceived as, for example, being a black box, lacking transparency. Something like the Hong Shenzhou incident, in which there was deaths in the military that were covered up. Actually, there have been deaths since then that were occurred under similar circumstances, did not provoke a backlash in the same way. I think the military is still seen as a kind of bastion of the KMT, and that has not changed. Yeah.
But Tsai Ing-wen is trying really hard to do that. She made the military a focus of her inauguration speech this year. And if you look at like the public buses have her with military now, like she's really trying to make the military acceptable again and palatable, but it's not easy. I mean, because these things are still really fresh. I mean, like Hong Xiong from the NPP, her entire entrance into politics was because her brother was the one who was killed during military training. It's like Brian said, it's a paradox. It's like people are like, I will never stand for China to invade Taiwan, never ever over my dead body. I don't really want to join the military.
Yeah, it's also interesting too, because I think then it raises the question: how is China evaluating this? For example, like it's it has seen that there would be something like the sunflower movement, but also then it looks like the military is like, well, people don't really want to join that. And so I think then that's when China gauging at what sentiment Taiwan is like is kind of weighing on both sides.
Yes, please.
So I have a question about constitutional change in Taiwan, which leads to a greater question about the political and legal mechanism and potential of Taiwan in the very long term. So as we probably all know, there is some talk about constitutional change in Taiwan, 改宪修宪, and something Freddie is very heavily involved in with the 2046 Taiwan, that group, which also includes people like Wang Jie and whatnot. And I mean, what I've been reading so far about constitutional change in Taiwan is that it's very incremental and not very tangible and to the root. So it's been mainly propagated by an agency conferred upon the constitutional courts to sort of just mediate conversations instead of making actual adjustments in the text.
Yeah.
And also when something like this comes up, usually the politicians say, oh, don't call. Like, oh, let's have a referendum. So I'm wondering about if people are really, I'm concerned that people are sort of placated by this. That, we're having these conversations and we're making progress, but then what is in the aftermath of Sunflower? What is the potential of this mechanism for actual change to the Constitution?
So there's two points I think that you're getting at. One is about constitutional change about Taiwan to become like Taiwan Goal or something, and then constitutional change as in just like to change the Constitution. Sorry, to repeat the question. What are how to summarize this? What is the status of kind of constitutional change, and what is the hope for constitutional change post Sunflower? Is that about right? So there is going to be constitutional change in the next year or so. It's going to be to change the voting age to 18. That's not a huge deal. It's kind of a relatively good change, but that's not kind of the groundbreaking constitutional change that people protest over. What people want is the potential to have constitutional change to kind of change Taiwan's status. The unfortunate truth is that most politicians don't want that. In fact, the DPP as a party doesn't want that. It's written into their party charter that they're only ever going to change the Constitution through public referendum if public referendum overwhelmingly votes to change the Constitution. Otherwise, the DPP will not propose any constitutional changes on Taiwan. Party policy. And even though Freddie's not in the DPP, he also realizes that to push that kind of thing is much more left field than they maybe most politicians are necessarily comfortable with, because that's one of the benefits of having people like Freddie or Tom Boy from State Building Party is third parties can propose these kind of more pro-independence themed policies. So I think an example would be like the passport cover change. A lot of pro-independence or even just pro-Taiwan people in general wanted the passport to not say China on it, and the DPP wasn't going to do that. That's not in the DPP's interest. But they found a compromise with this proposal, and now Taiwan is in big letters, and Zhonghua Minguo is still on the passport, and we're good. And that's really kind of what the DPP does right now with kind of these more pro-independence politicians. It lets them propose more pro-independence things. It takes those ideas and it finds a compromise that is palatable to people farther on the independent spectrum and does not completely upset kind of the larger voting base. But to get to your point about the odds of constitutional change happening to a higher degree than just something like voting age, it's very unlikely, because that requires, at least for something that actually changes Taiwan's status, it's not in the party's interest, and with the DPP being the majority party, I don't see that happening anytime soon.
Yeah, I think the DPP is pragmatic on the matter. Pushing for Taiwanese independence would cause regional disruption, and for example, the U.S. would be upset. Just viewing Tsai as a troublemaker, for example. And Tsai has been very good at avoiding this perception, actually. And so I think it's one of those traditional demands of the Pan-Green camp that there'd always be some lip service paid to that basically every time it comes up in the legislature. But it's unlikely that there'll be kind of substantive issue taken on that. I think also what's interesting is that you did have these debates erupting after some time regarding quote-unquote Chinese independence versus quote-unquote ROC independence. Do you try to change the name of the country and the flag and national insignia, or do you stick with the current ROC national iconography and so forth? Do you try to change the constitution, and so, or do you try to retain the current framework? And so the Referendum Act was changed, but that did forbid, for example, actually having a referendum on these issues regarding sovereignty. And so I think it's just there will be lip service paid to keep the deep Greens happy, but it's not actually going to get that far. And I think that's the interesting thing about young people. They are that are in politics after the Sunflower Movement is that they are pan-green, they're green, but they're not interested in that kind of ideological kind of deep green agenda, let's say.
Yeah, like Maggie pointed out, something that Shelley talks about with the research is that Gen Zers look at the ROC flag, like the red and blue one, and they don't cringe in the way that a lot of Sunflower activists cringe. They're fine with that being the Taiwanese flag. They don't identify as Chinese, but they know that that's not the Chinese flag. And I think for a lot of people that they don't, like the idea that everyone in Taiwan who identifies as Taiwanese wants independence right now is not a widely held ideal. And that kind of doesn't leave the DPP much incentive to act otherwise.
Yeah, it's a much older generation now. That's very, the RCO's flag is seen traditionally among the Pan-Green camp as a symbol of the KMT, because as the KMT party insignia, it's a symbol of authoritarianism. There's such backlash against that. And so I think among this younger generation, you see that less, for example. You see people going around wearing these ROC clothing things. It's also interesting too, actually, because a lot of Taiwanese diaspora, they have this notion which they get from the older generation they're raised by outside of Taiwan, in which they are very opposed to ROC iconography. It actually differs from what younger people now, the Gen Zers of Taiwan, feel, I think. And that's quite interesting, actually.
Yeah, it's a complicated diaspora politics versus Taiwanese politics thing, but someone who's 23 who was raised by a very deep green family in the US probably doesn't want anything to do with the ROC flag. And a 23-year-old born and raised in Taiwan is probably perfectly fine with the ROC flag. And that's just that's a disconnect.
I think maybe we should take like 2 more questions.
Yeah.
Yeah. Then we can chat more downstairs over drinks.
Well, I just more of a comment. You talked a little bit about you're talking about outcomes. You mentioned a little bit about technology and about issues of being a constitution. And I think it's worthwhile talking a little bit about GNV and some of the effort and what Audrey Tong is doing and some of the efforts, by some of the people involved with the Sunflower movement in, providing tech support and orchestrating direct democracy under that to now bring that through various other forums now. And I don't know if you have any thoughts or comments on that.
The question/comment was, new technology and kind of can you repeat?
So, I mean, there's a whole movement that came out of Sunflower as well with the the GOV.
Yeah.
And they're working through tech hackers, civil hackers, I guess the goal. And they've been doing a lot to create government transparency and to create direct democracy forums. Audrey Tong, the Minister at Large, has been promoting that. And I just think there's another aspect, another outcome of this work.
So yeah. I always call it like
Gov Zero.
Yeah.
That's how they
So Gov Zero definitely formed out of post Sunflower, but really it's changed a whole lot since Sunflower. I think that a number of the key leaders of Gov Zero originally are now in formal politics. I'm thinking of not just Audrey, but people like Xiao A, who's now was with the NPP and now was kind of part of Freddie's camp. And that's kind of led to a disconnect between Gov Zero post Sunflower and Gov Zero now, is that actually they're not nearly as comprehensive or as strong in their position as they used to be. But actually we have an expert on Gov Zero here. Sam is a master's student at Taida Sociology who's writing his master's thesis about Gov Zero, who you should chat to after.
I guess they formed
pre-Sunflower. Thank you.
We can talk about it more later.
Also, someone else that works in Audrey Tang's office might be here somewhere. Anyway, I think it's interesting because there has been this, experimentalism. There was an experimentalism, I think, in terms of efforts at direct democracy during the Sunflower movement. With what I mentioned, kind of General Assembly style things, discussing things online and so forth. But the question is, does that actually transition to actual effects, or does it become a sort of how do I put it? Just like a new face on old politics. A lot of, for example, just the things that are done in digital ministry, they're still subject to kind of the traditional bureaucracy. I think that's challenged a lot of these kind of younger, fresh faces that entered politics and became part of government in high-ranking positions sometimes, such as, Audrey Tang, like as the digital minister. But then you're a new person, younger, put on top of, a government bureaucracy, and you're still dealing with a kind of older, more traditional way of working with things. And sometimes clearing out those boundaries can be difficult. And the other criticism, I think, of particularly a lot of the entrance of young politicians into politics is that they're just kind of puppets of the older politicians. They're just kind of using them as a kind of younger face, but their actual ability to influence policy, create change, is actually fairly limited. And so I think that's a kind of flip side of things.
Yeah, just to on that last point, I think we have Audrey Tong, we have Lai Pingyu, we have Lee Nong, and obviously they're young, fresh faces to politics, but they're still kind of a part of the same apparatus that has been in existence for a long time. And so the idea that they're able to kind of push these kind of radical, transparent changes in government right away so quickly, I think is going to take some time still. One last question?
Yeah, last question. But there's still opportunity to talk after it. So.
Taiwan indigenous people, what was the knock-on effect for them from sunflower?
Yeah. So I think it's also very interesting. Okay.
Sorry. The question was for Taiwanese indigenous people, what was the impact of sunflower with these groups?
So I think also what's interesting is that there's a discourse of indigenous independence that arose after the movement, as advanced by people such as Namo Fupasidal, who has a talk here scheduled on April 16th. And so that's interesting too, because just I think Taiwanese indigenous people as young people were also caught up in these kind of identity trends. So there's increased discussion of what does indigenous identity mean. Also just what does indigenous independence mean. And so I think what's interesting too is that this is when you have the protests around later on, just for example, the traditional territories issue that Tsai Ing-wen promised to return traditional indigenous territories before being elected, but then after being elected, only returned those that were in government hands and public hands, and not those that were in private hands. And so then you have the interesting dynamics of someone like Panay, the indigenous singer-songwriter, playing at Tsai's inauguration and then protesting Tsai not too much longer after that. And so you have this kind of interesting dynamic there. But I think then just there is increased focus. There was the Indigenous Youth Front, which is still active today, which was one of the splinter groups that were active during the Sunflower Movement. And there's been, raising that with these kind of new focus on Taiwanese identity. Well, where are indigenous people within that framework? How are they excluded? And pointing these kind of systemic injustices. I think that's also an effect of the movement.
So one key way that I look at the NPP and kind of the pros and cons of indigenous impacts. So Freddie very much cares about indigenous politics, and when he when the NPP was going, he made it a priority to make sure that there are indigenous voices within the NPP. So one of the NPP's party list legislators, Gao Lu-Yong, was in legislature with the NPP for the first 3 years. She was later caught on embezzlement charges and kicked out of the party, but until then it was mostly positive. But but it wasn't always so good. In the NPP, and during their 2019 very first kind of party charter meeting, Freddie pushed that they should have a minimum of indigenous candidates for the NPP each election, and that was voted down. Which not the main reason Freddie was jaded by the NPP, but that most certainly was a reason of a point of disappointment for Freddie with the NPP, was that in the end, indigenous politics was not really something that was valued by NPP members.
I think what is interesting as well is that it did lead to kind of an entrance of a new generation of voices in terms of indigenous activists. And I think that is also interesting because indigenous politics has also had to navigate the pan-blue, pan-green minefield. And I think carving out a path for trying to get beyond that, let's say, because there has been long-standing views that indigenous. Look at the statistics. The older generation does overwhelmingly vote for the KMT, and so indigenous younger people trying to reclaim their heritage, but also trying to push for not push against their parents in that sense. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thanks. So a few announcements. So we we run the space, we learn. We have some events coming up. So for example, on Saturday, there's an exhibition here and a talk that will take place. It's about Formosa Plastics, which is a major polluter. It's created ecological disasters in Taiwan, Vietnam, Louisiana, other places. So it'll be about that. Next week on Friday, we have a language exchange. It's one of the events we do regularly. Just to have discussion of politics in different languages and create, break down barriers. We also have Taiwanese Hokkien classes, which if you're interested, you can ask about. We're also probably going to do reading groups in the future. We have future programming that will be announced next month regarding a reading group on a book on the Sunflower Movement. Also, Namono Fupasidal, the indigenous activist, is giving a talk on the 16th. Yes, it's on Panga feminism. And so, yeah, thanks for that. And we'll be chilling around downstairs. There'll be drinks, and so we can discuss more. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah. Good. Yeah. Stop sharing. Okay, how do I turn this off? Do I just end broadcast?